And the title of the homily that I came up with for you this evening is called Teaching Thick Hope in the Middle of an Apocalypse. And I want to begin, as many of my teachers have told me through the years, lead with the questions that I'd like to ponder with you this evening. What does it mean to anticipate in a time of great precarity? What does it mean even to anticipate? I liken the feeling of anticipation to an inner flame. Think of the anticipation you feel when you are falling in love with someone, or when you are aching deeply for a return to your earthly roots, or when you are aching for a reunion with the divine beloved. And these are often one and the same experience. That ache, that sense of devotion in which prayers for such a reunion rise naturally like incense from the heart, is the inner flame of anticipation. Anticipation walks strangely yet intimately hand in hand with patience. Anticipation is a kind of patient faith, a faith which is like the farmer waiting for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient with it. Anticipation waits on the obscure reality of the divine. Like our holy exemplars, St. John of the Cross, St. Francis, and Thomas Merton, amongst many others, we understand that it is humility and vulnerability which opens our most intimate desires for sacred love. Anticipation is an obscure faith, yet it is a deeply rooted faith. It is a faith which is real and which becomes the very experience of nesting within the love of God. We understand that it is no analogy or metaphor when God says that they will strengthen the hands that are feeble, make firm the knees that are weak, say to those whose hearts are frightened, be strong, fear not. This is not theory, but the absolute fact of God's love. We can and should know, like John the Baptist, that God's love is always emerging. God and God's love is as close to us, as it is said in the Holy Quran, as our jugular vein. I have the good grace of being able to practice my art of anticipation in the vocation which has called me, the sacred vocation of the teacher. After my first semester teaching religion in the natural world at Iona College, taking over from Sister Kathleen, I am left with another big question I want to ponder with you in the sacred silence and intention of our gathering. What does it mean to teach thick hope in the middle of an apocalypse? What does it mean to hope when the world seems to be ending every hour on the hour this year? Hope is one of those categories of being we take for granted until the marrow has been sucked out of the bone. Hope, like sustainability, like progress, even like climate change, has become a term which lends itself easily to the service of commodification, complacency, capitalism, turbo-capitalism, the banality of evil. Hope as a concept, when it's abused, becomes an obstacle to hope. Our hope is nothing but hoping against hope. So what then is thick hope? When facing my students this semester, and when I mean by facing, I made most of them like this on Zoom digitally, most of them with their cameras turned off too. So I was teaching to a bunch of black screens with names on it this semester. But yet I had a chance to really get to know a group of vulnerable, sincere, very earnest, and some intensely religious undergraduate students. When facing for the first time as a professor, in the middle of a historic pandemic, in the middle of all of America's traumas erupting all at once, the righteous flame of movements for justice, mixed with Twitter hissy fits on the daily, the whole sacred vocation of teaching illuminates amidst all this chaos. Fear and confidence and surrender to all matters of complexity and chaos and joy and disappointment and the surprise of students experiencing genuine metanoia. All of this swims in my head, heart, and body as I finish my first full semester as the teacher, as the professor that all of my spiritual and professional credentials have called me to be. They were helping cultivate this thick hope. On more than a couple of occasions, my students, especially those of whom came from Catholic school backgrounds, told me that this class religion in the natural world that I was teaching was very unlike any religion course they had ever taken before. By and large, this was a positive and enlightening experience for them, especially since I took care to illuminate the lasting legacy of the Franciscan tradition for ecological consciousness, change, and hope. In hindsight, I can easily imagine what it must have been like for Thomas Merton in his job as master of novices at the Abbey of Gethsemani in Kentucky, sharing parcels of wisdom from Sufi mystics, Eastern Orthodox masters of the sublime, and inscrutable Zen koans with young and impressionable and brilliant young people. So I threw a lot of different aspects of earth spirituality at my students this semester, and it was very enlightening for them, but I think it was also sometimes a lot of interesting things they've never heard before. I cannot help but to teach to others what is most dear and interesting to me. Even as we work within certain structures of academia, which may or may not actually facilitate learning, the teacher must be determined to transmit the living vitality of wisdom to the students. And perhaps even more so, be willing to receive such vital wisdom from the students themselves. Teachers are sacred and holy. And this is not to puff me up or puff us up. It's only to acknowledge that there's a sacred kernel to the art of teaching, which can't be truly touched or affected by the winds that blow away the various husks around it. It wasn't until I began to hear from my students throughout the semester, and especially towards the end of the semester, that I was able to take a deep breath and realize that what we had been doing all this time was actually pretty good. We were cultivating thick hope. Some of them told me that by the end of the course. This is a little sampling of some of their notes to me. Some of them said, I feel a certain indescribable connection with the natural world. I learned a lot about myself and the world around me. Thank you for giving me a brand new perspective on Earth. I wish I gained this new perspective earlier in my life, but I'm glad I have it now. I wish others could know how beautiful our home really is and make an effort in protecting it. Maybe we can work on something in Iona to create an ecologically sound environment. You really helped change my whole outlook on life and this planet and the things I can do. What is thick hope, then? How do we cultivate such a strange vine in the middle of an apocalypse? Let me turn to one of my teachers who gave me a brand new perspective on Earth. The constructive theologian Catherine Keller thickens hope back into its tangibility and earthiness by calling upon the Hebrew concept of tikvah. Keller explains that tikvah means literally a collection of fibers that are twisted together to make a strong and firm cord. It comes from the verb root meaning to collect. This fibrous hope has nothing to do with the future abstracted from the present, with pictures of a heavenly happy ending or just a markedly better tomorrow. Tikvah names not a projection of future, but an interweave of now. It signifies a cord collected, made strong by interweaving multiple fibers of time and narrative. It is a twisted hope that binds us to the loom of life now, in the now moment that knots or nets the past and its traumatism to the possible, to the future not of an illusion, but of the present. If we cannot hold it, bind it, in some fleshly mattering sense, it is not hope. So that is her definition of tikvah, thick hope, Catherine Keller. Thick hope emerges from sitting within the shadow side of 5 centuries of colonization, exploitation, abuse, objectification, and unearthiness. During a week in September, in which Iona faculty were asked to engage in a #scholar strike, I taught the students about decolonization, the doctrine of discovery, and climate justice. If it was the first time they've ever heard of these concepts, I fervently hope I planted enough of a seed in their understanding that will grow as they encounter these realities throughout their educational experience and their human journey. Thick hope comes from leaning into the very apocalypse we are experiencing every day and at every hour. if we are doing this all properly. What do I mean by this? Let's hear again from Catherine Keller and another one of my dearest teachers, the comparative theologian John J. Tatomanel, talk about the real meaning of apocalypse. When the term apocalypse is understood as unveiling, we can then ask the right questions. What does this pandemic unveil? What have we refused to see about ourselves and the precarious world we've built, a world that now stands exposed and tottering in the harsh light of this unasked for revelation? If we permit this crisis to expose the fissures of our failing world, this pandemic will have served as properly apocalyptic. If instead, despite its devastating toll, we return to an obsolete and unsustainable world, nothing meaningful will have been revealed. Thomas Merton was also an exquisitely apocalyptic human, a vessel of revelation and a prophet in his own right. I'll never forget when one of my dearest professors at Union Theological Seminary, Dr. James Cone, the creator of Black liberation theology and the most important theologian this country has ever produced, in my opinion, told me that Merton was one of the few white Americans in the 1960s who truly understood the plight of people of color fighting for their civil rights. And coming from James Cone, that means quite a bit for those of you who do know who Dr. Cone is. Dr. Cone pointed me to Merton's essay, Letters to a White Liberal, from the book Seeds of Destruction. In Merton's uncompromisingly regenerative analysis of the realities of racism and white supremacy, we are constantly being led to the moment of Kairos, of the inbreaking of divine love and reparation in which we are called to embody. We must be vessels of sacred resistance against any reality which justifies, as Merton writes, and these are very, very directly prophetic words for the moment right now, against any reality which justifies the conservative conclusion which clings blindly to the present impossible state of things and determines to preserve it at any cost, even that of a new civil war. Writing this back in 63, I think, and it's very appropriate for our moment. Instead, Merton tells us we must dare the dolorous price of change to grow into a new society. Nothing else will suffice. So apocalypse is not just a one-time event. Apocalypse is an opportunity to develop thick hope. And apocalypse tends to be kind of an ongoing thing for some peoples. Ask the peoples of color and peoples of poverty and their ghosts and ancestral spirits about the apocalypses they have experienced and continue to experience at the hands of the white supremacist, patriarchal, Wetiko Ahankar, which means false ego in the Bhagavad Gita. In every rupture is revelation. There is revelation either of the inconceivable, unforgivable evils a human collective can participate in the name of progress, or God, or insatiable perversion. There is also revelation of that kernel of sacred and holy truth, which can never be destroyed or affected by human evil. Apocalypse, as we're in now, can reveal the regenerative revelation of the wisdom of earth, of the divine presence in every atom and quark and quantum strangeness. Whereas the Catholic theologian Leonardo Boff writes, even a top quark becomes a sacrament, and the universe of stars and galaxies becomes a heavenly dance for the betrothal of human and divine love. Teaching thick hope in the middle of an apocalypse requires revelation of the shadow and of the light. The teacher must demonstrate to the students that we cannot just get stuck at the white wall of despair and hopelessness and ecological grief and criticism for the sake of criticism. We have to move forward. We must carry our grief forward as a sustainable fuel for constructing and anticipating the way forward. These pathways lead us into the Ecozoic era, as described by the Catholic priest, historian of religions, and geologian Thomas Berry. In this Ecozoic era, we are present to each other, to Earth, and to the cosmos in a mutually enhancing manner, in which, quote, we discover that every being has its own spontaneities that arise from the depths of its own being. These spontaneities express the inner value of each being in such a manner that we must say of the universe that it is a communion of subjects and not a collection of objects. What my students help me realize is that the sacred vocation which connects teacher and student is about the realization and experience of the numinous, as that which we describe variously as the divine, spirit, God, goddess, ineffable, mystical, erotic, ecstatic. What I came to discover was a natural craving in my students and amplified in my own journey for the very experience that, like gravity, the universe always tends to turn when unimpeded by human false ego, always turns towards relationality and compassion. As Thomas Berry suggests, we might consider our intimate, compassionate presence to Earth as originating ultimately in the curvature of space, as it is presented in modern science. The entire Earth community is enfolded in this compassionate curve, whereby the universe bends inwardly in a manner sufficiently close to hold all things together, and yet remains sufficiently open so that compassion does not confine, but fosters the creative process. There is a joy in teaching which always must be rediscovered and cultivated. What has now enhanced that realization is the understanding that this joy emerged through an embrace of the pastoral role that teaching calls us to. I am utterly incapable of teaching in any way other than care for the whole being of my students, from the atomic level to the cosmic level. The fact that many of my students will now experience Earth around them in an increasingly enchanted way gives me a sense of profound contentment. The only way we can actually cultivate thick hope is through a deep rooting in our earthiness, in our sacred embodiment. This is the root from which thick hope grows. Gathering the hopes of our students into this unbreakable cord, our communities into this unbreakable cord, is what makes the teacher sacred, the students sacred, and the community sacred.